afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this press briefing. Thank you again for joining us this week. We apologize for some technical issues and this slight delay in starting. Today we have a consultant to IATA, Dr. David Rockland, who's done some surveys for us on how passengers are looking at or perceiving the COVID-19 crisis. So what we'd like to do is to present a short summary of that study, and we've referred to it in a few of our previous briefings. Alexandre will give a few remarks to cover that, and then, as usual, we'll throw it open to questions and answers using the chat function. So with that, I'd ask David to take the floor and give us the overview of our public opinion research.
Great. Thank you, Tony, and good morning or good afternoon, good evening to each of you. What we're going to talk about here, as Tony mentioned, is an 11-country survey. This is wave 3 of it that we'll be showing you. We'll touch on some of the prior waves as well. And it's really how air travelers have been and anticipate responding to COVID-19. If we move to the next slide, the methodology slide, just a little bit about the survey. It was run first in February, then in April, then in early June. So about every 6 to 8 weeks. In the most recent survey, we surveyed 4,700 recent air travelers, and recent being since July of 2019. And we've kept that time frame the same so that these waves, in fact, are the same people in terms of when somebody took their last trip. Each sample in each of the 11 countries is split 50-50, business and leisure travelers. And that distinction is, it isn't rigid in the sense that one can do both. It's basically the answer to the question, which do you tend to do more? And the 11 countries that are included are listed on the right side of this page, ranging from Australia to the United States. Chile was added for the first time in April, so it was originally 10, and then now it's 11 surveys. If we move to the next slide, in terms of concern about contracting the virus, not surprisingly, it's high across the board. It's been high since February. It did increase significantly, 12 points in terms of very or somewhat concerned between February and April, and then dropped off 7 points, and that was really among those who are very concerned between April and June. And a point when you look at these numbers is, given that this is an evolving situation, at any point in time, these numbers may vary depending on what's going on with the pandemic. For example, if we look at, which countries changed the most between April and June, we find that Canada and the U.S. each dropped 12 points. France dropped 15 points in terms of very or somewhat concerned. But if you're here with me in the United States and you're watching the huge outbreaks that's occurring right now in the southern part of our country, you probably get a resurgence of concern at this point in time. So again, think of these numbers as somewhat fluid. But concern is high across the board. The lowest number we saw in June was 76% in terms of concern in Australia. Highest was 97% in India. If we move to the next slide, one of the questions is, do you know someone who's been or might have been infected? And not surprisingly, between April and June, that number went up as the pandemic continued. It's interesting, perhaps, though, to look at the countries and where do those numbers jump the most? Well, they jump the least in Australia, in Singapore, in Japan, in France, and on the other hand, in the UAE and Chile, you've seen increases above 25% in terms of people knowing someone or themselves having been infected. If we move to the next slide, it's the answer to the question, so what are people doing about this? How are they reacting to it? And it was interesting, back in February when we first asked this question, about 1 out of every 5 respondents said, I'm not doing anything. And now we look at it here in June, and that number has dropped to really 2%, saying I haven't taken any steps. And then as we look forward and we ask the question, once the pandemic has subsided, the numbers on the right side of this page, we see I will not take any steps in the future, also a low number. So some of these behaviors that people have been adopting are expected to stay and stay for a while. Probably the number here for IATA and this audience of greatest concern is how many people have said they've avoided air travel and how many anticipate doing so in the future. In terms of those who say they have, it's 58% here in June. In terms of a continuation to do so in the future in some way or another, that number drops 25 points to 33%. But you also see another change when it comes to traveling in general. You expect disinfectants to be more a part of your life. At 46% saying they're using it when traveling now, that number goes up in the future. And then some of the other behaviors that we'll probably see, at least, looking forward as things we do, washing your hands. It was more often. It was 44% in February, goes to 77% in June. And in terms of people saying, yeah, I'm going to continue to do that, it's 73% in terms of looking toward the future once the pandemic has subsided. If we flip to the next slide and we say, okay, so what are people concerned about when it comes to air travel? And we asked this question among 12 different items for the airport and 11 different items aboard the aircraft. One of the findings was that people are concerned about everything. And again, this is travel after the pandemic has subsided. And so we then ask, okay, well, of all the things you're concerned about, which is pretty much across the board, what are the things that you're most concerned about? And what you're seeing on this slide are the top three. And they generally focus around being around other people or using restrooms, to be blunt about it. In terms of, what are you worried about at the airport? It's being on a crowded bus and train on your way to the aircraft is the way we ask the question. Looking back, you always look at your surveys and go, oh, could we have done something different? And the use of the word crowded was in this sentence, and maybe that forces that up a little bit, but it does continue to drive home the point. It's about being around other people, and certainly sitting next to someone who might be infected, the top concern, and very much the top concern in terms of what you're worried about on the plane is something that's there. In terms of another level or issue of concern, if we move to the next slide, one of the things we want to know is, are you concerned about getting the virus while you're traveling, or are you concerned about quarantine? And we asked this both in June and in April, and what you see is they're pretty similar. In other words, both concerned about catching the virus oneself, but also about either quarantining or being quarantined while traveling, or being quarantined upon returning from travel. It's a little lower for when you get home, but still the idea of quarantine as an area of concern and as an area that may stymie travel is something that's very clear in the survey and something to, in fact, be paying attention to. And again, these questions, pretty much all of this is after the pandemic has subsided. So moving to slide 8, return to travel when? This is the big question. When are people going to come back to traveling as usual once the pandemic has subsided? And one of the changes we see between April and June, in April, in terms of a month or two or less, it was 61%. We asked the same again here in June, and we get the number of 45%. So people are basically saying, at least in this survey, that they're going to wait a little longer. And that I would venture that as this pandemic plays out, the longer it lasts, the more people are concerned about when they might return to travel. In fact, because it may be nothing to do with travel as much as their own habits have changed. But if we go to the next slide and we say, okay, so once the pandemic subsides, how do people say they think they will behave? And again, this is hypothetical. This is about what you might do or what you expect to do in the future. And we see a weird dichotomy in the answer to this question. This is likelihood of doing each of the following once the pandemic has subsided. People say about 2/3 across the 11 countries that they expect to travel less for business or leisure. And then on the flip side of that, the numbers that are a little lower in this chart, is you see 3 items in terms of travel as soon as possible. And those numbers are all quite a bit over 50%, meaning a majority expect to do some travel by air as soon as possible. So you have a sort of combination of, I don't think I'll travel as much, but on the flip side, I'm going to travel soon. There's one could almost conjecture that there's a pent-up demand for that. So what's going to help? Let's move to the next slide in terms of what people say it will be important to them to get over anxieties related to any kind of travel, air travel as well. And so we ask the question of, which of the following do you agree with? How do you feel about different things related to travel? And what really pops in this chart are masks. Masks help, whether it's yourself or whether it's the crew or other hospitality workers. Masks are an important sign that this is being dealt with, and it does reduce, if you will, concern or anxiety, or at least expected concern or anxiety. In terms of the air quality on the plane, it's interesting that you get sort of a mixed reaction. On the one hand, 57% say, yeah, I think I'm worried about the air quality on the plane. On the other hand, a very similar number says, well, the air quality on the plane is just as clean as an operating room. So you do wind up with, let's call it mixed feelings in terms of cabin air. If we then move to the next slide and we say, okay, here's a list, and this was a list of 12 items of things that would make you feel safer. And this is how much would feel safer, a lot, somewhat, etc. And one of the things we found is much like if you ask people, what are you concerned about in the airport or in the aircraft, you kind of get an answer kind of like everything. You get the same answer when you say, okay, well, what would you make you feel safer? And so of the 12 items we asked, the range in terms of a lot or somewhat safer was 70 to 84%. Insurance was the one that was lowest. The rest were all around 80% or higher. And so here again, we asked the question, okay, then pick your top three, because there's very little differentiation, because everything really in some respects makes people feel safer. And what you see here in terms of those top three, again, it relates to other people screening passengers at departure. Mandatory masks, and masks do play a very important role. Temperature testing of passengers, social distancing, and again, that idea that I'm most concerned about, sitting next to somebody who's infected, social distancing, not surprising, plays a role here. We also asked about knowledge in terms of what are the things you want to know, and we gave a lot of choices in the survey, and the answer was knowledge helps. The more you know, the safer you feel in terms of air travel in the future once the pandemic subsides. Moving to the next slide, we asked people, and we asked 15 different items. So what are you personally willing to do when the pandemic subsides in terms of air travel? And here are the top 6 answers. People say they would take a temperature check, they would wear masks. And if you look at these numbers, you go, okay, people are willing to do things. And there's a mixed answer here, and I would sort of take this sort of two different ways. If you want to look at this in a positive way, then basically if you look at the none answers, people say, no, I'm not willing to do anything. It was down at 3%. On the flip side, across 15 different things we asked, we never got answers over more than 4 and 10. So people are willing to do some things, but not others. But if you said, okay, what are the easiest ones or easiest in terms of what people say they'll do, it has to do around temperature check before you get on a plane, wearing a mask. Preferred, not surprisingly, is undergo a 14-day self-isolation. That was down at 17%. Moving to the next slide, we did ask the question about what kinds of products or services might get people more likely to travel sooner and start flying sooner. And we asked about availability of insurance products related to COVID-19 disruptions. 44% said, yes, this would get me to fly sooner. Ask about cheaper or easier visa processes, similar numbers. So you have about 4 and 10 people who say, you know what, if it was easier to, A, get my money back if through insurance, if something changed, or get an easier approach to a visa. You have 4 out of 10 people responding to that as something they would be responsive to, and therefore more likely to travel again. And then moving to slide 14, what's the profile of the first to return? So one of the things we did in the survey, and this is a huge survey, 3 waves of it, the report's 100 pages, but we also, in the course of doing this, created 5 personas. And these personas are based around the idea of how soon you would wait to return to travel as usual. So if we look here at the people who say, I'm not going to wait at all, I'm ready to go, just tell me when the pandemic's over, it's about 12% of the total survey population, and it's consistent pretty much across countries. In terms of some countries, that tends to have people who will travel quicker. Maybe France and Germany, those slowest, are Singapore and Japan in terms of returning to travel. But we learned a couple things when we did these profiles. One was we were hoping to see that what would make people feel safer, or what your concerns about, what you want to know more about, that we see differences across these different profiles of people in terms of when they say they're going to return to travel as usual. And the answer, we didn't see differences. So this same idea about sitting next to somebody, the air on the plane, toilets in the airport or on the plane, that's pretty much ubiquitous across the board, irrespective of when you plan to return to travel. If you said, well, what makes these people different? And there's probably 2 items, and they're in the top left of this chart, and this chart has a lot of data in it. But the 2 things to call out is the people who say they're going to return quickest to travel are those who are not at all or not very concerned about the virus. Among those people not concerned or not very concerned, it's 30% of that group of people say I'll come back quick, as opposed to 12% of the total survey. They also tend to believe it'll be declared safe to travel sooner. So it's a very logical answer in terms of I expect it to be safe sooner to travel, therefore I will travel sooner. So that is a quick summary of 3 waves of survey data, almost 5,000 people across 11 countries. But I hope it gave you a sense of how the traveling public is feeling and responding to COVID-19, and how they say they will and expect to in the future. So turning to my thank you slide and turning it back to you, Tony.
Great. Thank you very much, David. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alexandre to give some sort of overall remarks, and then to put that into context, and then we'll open it up to questions.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining this call. David has presented some of the insights that we have gleaned from a passenger survey that, as he said, we have been conducted every few months in this crisis. We are now at a stage where some parts of the world are starting to open up, Asia and Europe mainly, and therefore understanding the concerns of travelers is important, because their willingness to travel will drive the recovery. So there are a few key messages that I see in the results of this survey. The first is that, as we have discussed in this call before, we can expect that this crisis will have a long shadow. Fewer passengers are saying that they will travel again in the first month after the pandemic. In early April, 61% said that they would. By early June, that fell to 45%. And about 2/3 are seeing less travel in the future, be it for vacation, visiting friends, relatives, or business. That's why we continue to remind that relief measures must extend beyond the initial emergency situation. Cost reduction in any form will be critical. Reduced charges, taxes, user fees, or administrative burdens like slots, use it or lose it rules. The second message is that passengers will not travel if governments impose quarantine. This week, we have seen the UK and the EU adopt or announce alternatives for what are perceived as low-risk destinations. Other destinations are using testing as a screening methodology, although doing this accurately, quickly, and at scale still poses challenges. And the more countries implement the ICAO takeoff guidelines, the better deterrence we will have to symptomatic travelers because of health checks and declarations. On top of this, airlines are offering flexibility in rebooking, so there is no economic incentive to travel when sick. As testing becomes faster, more accurate and scalable, pre-travel detection or pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic travelers will become possible, particularly from locations perceived to be higher risk. The science for testing is advancing quickly, but we are still not where we need to be. Of course, there is the need for general anti-COVID-19 measures in country, social distancing and contact tracing. Outbreaks involving travelers can be managed using the same methodology as are used for the general population, and we are seeing governments becoming more precise and targeted with these measures to limit the economic damage. The third message is that the ICAO takeoff guidelines go far to addressing travelers' main concerns for sanitization and human interaction. Masks or face coverings address the difficulty of social distancing in public spaces, including on board aircraft. Human interaction is being minimized with contactless processes, and deeper and more frequent sanitization will address critical concerns for many high-touch areas, including washrooms and toilets. It is also clear that we have to do better at getting out the message on two fundamental issues. First, the aircraft cabin is one of the most controlled environments that people could experience. First, risk is reduced by screening our symptomatic travelers. Then, air is exchanged with fresh air from outside every 2 or 3 minutes on most aircraft. That's 20 or 30 times more frequently than most office buildings. And HEPA filters take out viruses, including the coronavirus, with each filtration. The second is that while effective social distancing on board is not possible, even neutralizing the middle seat from sail does not create the recommended 1 to 1.5 meter distance. A layering of measures will keep travelers safe. Again, we screen out symptomatic travelers before they get to the aircraft and require everybody to wear a mask or facial cover. The mask requirement is the general advice of governments for areas where social distancing is not possible, like public transport. And on top of that, there are several design features that limit the spread of virus-carrying droplets on board. Movement of air forward and up in the cabin is limited by seat backs and a ceiling-to-floor airflow. And with everybody oriented forward, there is a limited face-to-face contact. Passenger confidence will not be rebuilt overnight. We will need to keep reinforcing these messages as we move forward. But I am hopeful that as people start to travel again, we will build up some momentum. With Europe's internal borders now largely open, I personally took my first trip to Paris by plane, wearing a mask, keeping distance, avoiding contacts. Does make travel different, but not so different. And the level of cooperation among travelers is significant. So the processes worked. With time, travelers will become more used to these measures, although we hope that they will be temporary. And airports and airlines will become even better at managing people flows. So the trip felt different, but not so different. Everything is pretty acceptable and bearable, and the changes are not so huge, and they are broadly accepted, at least by the passenger with whom I was traveling in this aircraft. If that is the price for the freedom to travel, you can count me in, and it's not a high price. On that note, we are very happy to take your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandre. So we'll open it up to questions via the chat function. I see we have a couple in. I'll deal with the first one myself early, which is why was China not included in the survey? And when we began doing the survey, essentially China was the focal point of this crisis. And the idea was to look at how it was impacting more broadly. So that's the simple reason for it. But we do believe, and David, maybe you can confirm this, that we have a very broad mix of countries, so we are able to draw some general trends or conclusions from the list of countries you have. But maybe, David, you have something else to add to that?
Just that perhaps if there's a future wave, it would be good to include China. But you're right, Tony. When this first began back in February, it was sort of thought of as an issue in China, at least, at the top among many countries before this had really taken off, and so therefore wasn't included. But we do see sort of remarkable consistency across the countries for the most part. Things like concerns, steps you've taken, what you're concerned about on the aircraft or in the airport in terms of safety. So I think almost irrespective of which countries you include, and certainly we have a broad cross-section of countries, you get similar results and similar findings.
Okay, thank you, David. We now have a question about people's expectations. And it refers to the slide of saying that, suggesting that there might be some pent-up demand building as people are waiting to travel. And the question is, do you think that a successful first trip by a passenger might sway people to reconsider their overall frequency of travel back towards historical levels? So maybe, Alexandre, you've talked about your first experience. Do you think people would be encouraged if they experienced something similar?
Probably. I hope. Frankly, I don't know. Probably, yes.
Okay. Okay, David, would you have anything to add to that in terms of what the data is telling us?
Well, I think the data is certainly saying that there is some pent-up demand. People want to see other people, want to get back to business, want to take a vacation. And I think it is conjecture because we don't ask the question. But certainly one can expect if one had a good first trip and second trip and hopefully third trip, then that you would see a lot of these concerns begin to change and perhaps this wearing masks and disinfectants becoming a new normal people get used to and feel comfortable with.
Okay, thank you, David. Okay. So we have a question that's not so concerned about the survey, but it comes to us from the UAE. And it says that there's a new carrier launching, Air Arabia Abu Dhabi, starting in July. Wizz Abu Dhabi is applying for its AOC as well. So how does IATA view these new airline startups and their sort of prospects, I guess, in the current difficult climate?
We view that as an encouraging sign that there is still people who are ready to launch an airline because they anticipate that there is enough demand for air travel. It's a good sign.
Okay. We have a question about one of the survey results, which was the focus on washrooms and toilets. And the question is, I guess, what's the guidance around that? And I know, Alexandre, in the guidance by ICAO, they do talk about frequent sanitization of the aircraft and such. Maybe you wanted to.
For the washroom and the toilets, they are frequently sanitized, but the main issue there is to reduce the number of people moving in the aircraft during the flight. So to try to organize the best possible way the flow of people going to the washroom and toilets. That's the key issue. And additionally, they are sanitized more frequently.
Okay. We have a question. Maybe this is for Brian. And basically the question says, with the data we're seeing or the trends we're seeing in this survey, does that impact IATA's outlook as to when travel demand or how travel demand will come back?
It certainly influenced our thinking because we're in unprecedented conditions. It's really important to get a fix, a quantitative fix on consumer sentiments and consumer behaviour. So, this survey and the two before have been really important in helping us understand, how much pent-up demand there is and the sort of things that consumers are concerned about. And it was pretty clear that, typically as the industry comes out of, say, a recession, they would normally get passengers back by low fares to stimulate demand. And clearly, this time round, there's a real need to restore confidence. Clearly, also, this latest survey shows that confidence is still very fragile. The number of people saying that they were going to travel within the next few months has fallen. And we've certainly taken a more conservative view in our expected recovery in travel. Having said that, though, what we have seen in the last couple of weeks is a very encouraging rise in flights and also in bookings in Europe as travel starts to open up. Back to you, Tony.
Great. Thank you, Brian. We have a question about a couple of the survey findings. Alexandre, you said that the industry needs to communicate more about cabin air and the sort of social distancing on the aircraft and all of that sort of environmental stuff. But the question is more about how about policies that passengers flout? For example, does the industry need to do a better job of ensuring that passengers wear masks when required? And as a context, the question comes from the US, where I suppose mask wearing is a bit more of an issue.
The answer is everybody has to do whatever is needed to prevent the virus transmission, whether it's mask or something else. Everybody has to act in the same way. Airlines, as airports, as security checkpoints. Everybody who is involved in the chain, the journey, has to participate into that. In some European airports, it's not totally clear. Still not totally clear that it's mandatory to wear a mask. So you are strongly advised, but it's not an absolute obligation. We should have probably something clearer.
Something clearer from governments?
From everybody, at least from the airport authority, if it's the airport which is managing that, from the government, from the airlines as well, when it's not the case.
Okay. We have a question about travel insurance. It says that some airlines offer travel insurance through third-party companies, but as COVID coverage is very difficult to obtain, does IATA expect airlines to make greater efforts to provide such insurance and thereby increase passenger confidence about traveling?
We are negotiating with the insurance company to find this type of coverage, but this type of coverage will be something that will come in addition to the airfares as probably an option offered to passengers to subscribe an insurance that cover the quarantine, the treatment, the testing, or the various expenses that someone could be exposed due to COVID. What we can do is to channel the insurance companies into this type of product to be offered to the passengers.
Okay.
What we are doing, by the way.
Great. We have a question for David. Question asks, did the survey find out anything about passenger confidence in the diligence and the attention to detail of cleaning staff at airports or on aircraft?
A good question, and it sort of gets a little bit back to the one a few minutes ago about restrooms. One of the things that does make passengers feel more safe is to know about the sanitation procedures and to, in fact, see them, whether it's on the airplane or in the airport. And so in terms, we didn't have a question to answer the question specifically. We didn't have a question specifically about, do you think they do a good job? But seeing that job being done and also knowing how it's done are important to making passengers feel safer.
Great, thank you, David. We have a sort of two-part question. The first is, did the survey turn up anything regarding the food service or beverage service in the cabin? And David, as I recall, I think we did have a question on that.
There is a reduced service. There is a reduced service in the cabin usually.
Yeah.
A reduced service, so prepackaged food. So something that has been adapted, to minimize the contacts.
Yeah. And if I remember correctly, the survey didn't show the catering as being a very high concern, but it still registers as at a certain level of surfaces that passengers may touch. Mm-hmm. So that's the first part of the question. Sorry, David?
No, I was just going to add, yes, we did ask how concerned are you on board the aircraft about consuming catered food and beverage items. And to your point, Tony, look, people are concerned about everything. But in terms of relative concern, this was relatively one of the lower numbers.
Yeah. And then the second part of that question is about movement in the cabin. And I guess the point of the question is just asking, what are the rules or what is the principle behind the guidance on movement around the cabin?
The principle is clear, is to avoid useless movement. So you move if needed, because you have to go to the washroom or toilets, or because you have any urgent problem that need you to move, but otherwise you stay seated.
Okay. We have a question from Africa and Middle East. It says indications are that revenues are down 60% in Africa and Middle East regions. There's quarantine in 36 countries. So what can IATA do to assist the region to get back on its feet?
What we are doing is we are advocating very strongly the countries, to release the quarantine measures and to implement the CART report set of measures, because there is no question not to do anything, but to implement what has been worked out and recognized as an effective and efficient, protection for passengers and for states to minimize the risk of virus transmission. So we are advocating against quarantine measures in favor of implementing the CART report. And as I mentioned just before, but it's not totally ready, but when it is, we will probably advocate strongly in favor of implementing a testing system, but provided the testing system is ready.
And then also, Alexandre, specifically for Africa, we've also done a fair amount in terms of trying to get.
For the measures for the financial relief, as some states were indicating, the lack of financial means to support their airline sector, we have written to many international agencies, development agencies, or international bank or financial institutions to put together some funds to help states to support their travel and airline and tourism and airline sector. And with pretty good success, African Union has said that they will help significantly the airline sector. The African Development Bank has also put together a plan. So the support has been significantly positive from these organizations.
Thank you, Alexandre. We have another question about the findings of the survey, and it's for Brian. Do the findings of the survey make you more or less confident about air travel demand or bookings for the winter season?
I think it's very hard to draw any conclusions from this for the winter season, because one of the other features that we've seen, another change in passenger behaviour, is people are booking quite late. Previously, a significant number of people booked more than 20 days in advance. Today, we're finding that over 40% of passengers are booking within 3 days of the travel date. So, with the winter season starting, out in November, there's very little visibility of that at the moment. I guess what this survey does show us is that there are still considerable concerns. A larger portion of people said that they wouldn't be travelling within the next few months. So, as I said earlier, it's not just a matter of airlines offering low fares. There's a task here to rebuild passenger confidence.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Then we have a question, I suppose, for David and for Alexandre. In the survey results, was there something that surprised you?
Not really, because we understand, that passengers may have concerns, that, considering the enormous amount of worrisome information they have received about the pandemic, it's not totally surprising that people are worried. The evolution, perhaps, of the concern about air travel is disappointing, because we went from something around 46 up to 61% of people, being really concerned to take a flight with no real reasons except an additional set of worries. But that's probably the most disappointing part. And it's disappointing because we think that we have implemented a lot of protective measures. We have communicated a lot. Perhaps we should do more. We should explain more. We should send more detail. We should justify what we have done and the reason for that, and the expected effects of the measures we are implementing. And confirming that the safety of our passengers is our top priority, as always.
Okay. And David, as a survey professional, did anything in the results surprise you?
I'd say there might be two things that sort of surprised me. One is we have a standard tracking question in here that we've asked also in prior surveys just about air traveler satisfaction. And one of the things we find in that survey, and we've been doing this question for a while, is, satisfaction with your most recent trip. And again, your most recent trip has always been very, very high. And one would think with all these concerns and anxieties that just there being a side effect called, when you ask about satisfaction, you'd be more concerned, therefore your number would come down in terms of satisfaction, and that didn't decrease. It remains very high in the mid-90s across all countries. And I guess the other thing, and this may reflect entirely a bias of someone who lives in the U.S., and the fact that, the reality is we don't seem to have this under control or even have a smart path forward in many respects, is the concern level. When we saw it drop from April to June and drop 12 points in terms of the very concerned numbers, and drop in the United States 12 points as well. That to me was surprising. And again, that probably is a U.S. view. We have an apartment in New York. It's been an epicenter. So maybe I'm just channeling my own view here in the U.S. and that we don't seem to have this under control. But I was surprised by that finding, and again, that may be jaundiced by a U.S. view.
Okay, thank you, David. We have a couple of last questions. So the questioner asks if there were any findings regarding the flexibility that airlines are providing for tickets, refunds, change fees, etc., and whether that will impact passenger confidence. And David, I don't recall that we actually put anything in the survey with respect to that. Is that correct?
We didn't have anything in terms of passenger confidence. We did have a couple of questions in terms of how have airlines handled this if you had a flight canceled or change your flight. And generally speaking, excellent and good in terms of how this was handled for passengers, and what they received in return was over 3 out of 4 people said this, for what it wasn't a happy outcome, but it was handled well by the airlines. But we didn't have anything related to confidence moving forward as a result.
Right. But certainly the response on the insurance question indicates that at least over 40% of people would fly with more confidence if those insurance products were available to help insure against potential disruptions during travel. And then the last question, Alexandre, is a follow-up from the question on Africa. So there have been lots of comments or commitments, but not necessarily money in the bank from that discussion. Do you see a need for IATA to do more to try and encourage the commitments that have been made to actually be fulfilled?
Not more than we are doing in other part of the world. In other part of the world, we have seen a lot of announcement, but we are also advocating a lot in favor of real implementation. We need the money in the bank or in the balance sheet or in the P&L, and that's true everywhere in Africa as well. After the announcement, we need things to be done.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. There are a couple more questions in the queue that are about specific markets or specific future survey potentials. We aren't releasing the market-specific data, only in aggregate. So the answer to that is we don't have that data to share. But if people do have direct questions about the survey, please do send us an email at corpcoms@iata.org. So thank you again for joining this weekly briefing. We've been doing this now for several months. I think the plan going forward will be to revert from a weekly cadence to perhaps a bi-weekly or once every 3 weeks, just so that we make sure that when we do these briefings, we have some significant information to share. We're sort of at a point in this crisis now where things aren't moving as fast as they were at the beginning. But please look forward to the invites in your inbox. We'll give you plenty of advance notice. And when we do these briefings in future, we will keep the same time slot on a Tuesday mid-afternoon Europe time. So thank you again for your participation, and look forward to talking to you the next time.